Wondering how your mindset affects your life? How to bring more energy into your business and life? Millions of people around the world ask these same questions daily. You are in the right place. Learn practices that will help give your life the meaning and success you've been searching for. Welcome to the Charge Podcast, teaching you how to create habits around real goals every day. Practical life advice from those who made it. Here's your host, Gary Wilbers.
Welcome, Chargers. We're glad to have you here again this week for another great guest. I tell you, the Charge Podcast likes to bring different guests each week that brings a different viewpoint, allow you to think about it. Remember, Charge is about create habits around real goals every day. Let's get into the podcast today because I've got a special guest with us, Josh Varner. He's a trauma-informed speaker and a school social worker with a passion for helping individuals and schools to support students who have been impacted by childhood trauma. Josh has presented over 150 high-energy, informative, interactive presentations to audiences all over the country. Along with speaking, Josh has been a social worker, professional school counselor, and coordinated an at-risk student program. Josh has experience in the classroom working with traumatized students and knows what will work for teachers. Josh, it is great to have you on the Charge Podcast. Welcome, my friend.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, we are excited to have you. You and I go back a few years and got to know each other, and you're doing some great things in the schools as well as the information that you're sharing with teachers. But I think there's always a story that gets us started. So I'm kind of curious for how did you decide to go in this line of work and then kind of move into some of the speaking and other things that you're doing currently?
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting story. You know, I just wanted to be a college football coach. I got my master's in school counseling, but while I was getting my master's, I was a GA, kind of the grunt on the football team as a coach, and I fell in love with it. I mean, I wanted to do that. That was my passion. I got an opportunity to coach college football at a handful of different places, and it was going great. Then I met my wife. We got married. We had a couple kids. I have 3 children now, but at the time we had 2. And you actually got to see Joe Paterno and Bobby Bowden speak at a national conference, and they said, what was your biggest regret? And it was that they didn't get an opportunity to raise their own kids. They weren't around their own kids that much. And so I kind of came home with that in my heart. And then we were in a situation where we were going to have to move again. You know, coaching college football is pretty transient. And I just had to made that shift. I was like, I got to be around more. You know, I was working those 15-hour days, 7 days a week, all those kind of things. And so I made the shift, and I had the master's in school counseling, so I took a job as a social worker. And what I found was my master's did a really good job of teaching me how to use the DSM-4 TR. Back then it's the DSM-5 now, but it's the mental health diagnostic book, and really I could label kids. That's what it taught me how to do, you know, ODD, ADHD, bipolar, whatever. But I didn't really feel like it taught me how to support kids, how to understand kids, how to help kids. And I saw my first trauma-informed speaker about 10 years ago, and it really was a transformational thing for me. It really shifted my paradigm from what's wrong with these kids to what happened to these kids. I got a bunch of tools, and I started seeing a lot more success with the kids I was working with. And so I really just became geeked up on the topic. I tried to learn as much as I could, podcasts and books and going to conferences and you name it. And then about 3 years ago, one of our mutual friends, Julie Gramlich, is on the board for they do a lot of educational programming with the Anne-Marie Project, and I kept saying, hey, this is a topic we need speakers on, and she was like, eventually she's like, why don't you speak on it? And, you know, I think you know this, Gary, but speaking is the number one fear in the world. You know, people they're more afraid of speaking than they are death. And so it was a little bit scary, but I actually reached out to you. You gave me some great tips. I tried to craft a message that I thought would be really engaging, and then I've been really blessed. It's got an opportunity to share this message all over the country. I really just wanted to share it in Jeff City when I started, and it's really kind of spread all over the place and really become a passion project of mine.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you sharing that because I think it sets up the stage of what topic we're going to talk about. And we're going to talk about some of that today and really kind of my first question thought is, can you tell me why the trauma-informed movement is so important? I think, you know, we all can have reasons we think it is, but why is it so important in the school setting for educators to start to realize that there's more underneath the skin?
Yeah, yeah. And so there was a big landmark study called the ACE study. That stands for Adverse Childhood Experience. This is the largest longitudinal study of all time done by the CDC. Basically, they took 17,000 people and they looked at how much childhood trauma they experienced, and they wanted to correlate that with what the outcomes were like later on in life. And a couple of things they found was about 1 out of 8 students in our school systems have been highly traumatized, had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. And typically, once we get to that 4 or more, we consider that high risk, and we start to see a lot of more negative outcomes. And so what I found is that most of our schools do a great job of educating kids that haven't been impacted by trauma. I think that's what they understand, but I don't think we necessarily do a great job of supporting those kids that have been impacted by trauma. And so what I'm passionate about is going in, meeting with those educators, filling in those gaps, helping them understand those behaviors, helping them get tools that are going to help build relationships that ultimately help those kids be successful.
Yeah, because with regular education, one of their challenges is they get the material how to educate the children. But of course, those underlying challenges becomes, of course, a challenge because, of course, if they're in the classroom, a lot of times it can be in disruptive behavior, correct?
Yeah, exactly. And so a lot of times, people have fight, flight, and freeze responses because of their childhood trauma. And so a lot of times that fight response looks like an aggressive behavior. That flight response is a kid shutting down and pushing people away. And so a lot of times we view that stuff as a choice. We view that stuff as, disrespect. We view that as a kid, kind of wrecking our classroom. And really what, the answer to that problem is building that connection, building that relationship, teaching that kid how to self-regulate, giving that kid opportunities to learn how to cope. And when we do that, those kids can be successful. I see that, in my line of work every day. And it's not that these educators don't want to know or don't want to support these kids. A lot of times they just, from their education, the opportunities they had, a lot of this stuff is pretty new. They just haven't had an opportunity to learn it yet. And so it's exciting to see those light switches go on and see, those folks get some new tools and help kids be successful that historically haven't been successful in school.
Yeah. And I think that's the key is it's like anything is education. You've got to have the tools to be able to handle the situations. And when we've not been given those, because in the education realm, then that's what you're able to share. Share with me, if you would, Josh, maybe a story from an educator perspective or from the child perspective, and of course we don't want you to use names, of course, anything of that nature, but how it impacts and makes a difference to the educator or the child if they have someone that's supporting them.
Yeah, so I got an opportunity to work with a young person this year at my school that had a pretty significant trauma history. The first time I ever met her, she was underneath a desk, and to me it was very obvious she was very, very scared. Making some strange sounds. She hadn't been successful in education before, and so I was getting her as a 6th grader, and so she didn't have a successful track record. But really what we worked on is regulation, and so every time she was dysregulated, she was scared is really what happened. She was coming to a new environment with new people. We helped her get calm. We helped her get regulated. And I'm not going to lie, this was a pretty severe, extreme case, but 5, 6, 7 times a day, I'm going down to that classroom, helping that kid get re-regulated. But I can tell you, it was amazing, in a lot of ways, a miracle. After about a month, she's coming to school and she's smiling. And then by mid-semester, she's learning so much, and we're changing her plan. And then I'm telling you, by the end of the year, my favorite part of my school day every day was her coming to her school, smiling, being successful. So many of these challenges had disappeared because she had that connection, she had that relationship, she had that safety. And so it really, for me, was such a aha moment. Like, if this kid can be successful and this kid can be successful so quickly, it's pretty impressive. And it's not me. I don't want to take all the credit. I mean, she has amazing people she works with every day, but we really follow these principles of this trauma-informed education process. And to see those kids be successful, I mean, that's like the best thing in the world to me.
Yeah. Well, it changes her life forever.
That whole trajectory. And that's the cool thing about neuroplasticity is, we used to think that, well, if you had a rough start to your life, there's really nothing we can do about it because so much neuroplasticity happens at a young age. But really what the latest research is saying, we have, even me and your age, Gary, we still have neuroplasticity, not as much as younger people do. But, I think anytime we work pre-K through 12th graders, I mean, they have so much neuroplasticity. There's so much change that can happen at their life at any point. And so we really need to take advantage of that. And we can really change trajectories of their life during that time.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that because I think it puts into context what we're talking about there. How do you see, kind of that post-traumatic growth? We kind of shared it in that example that's there. But how is that possible for these people to be able to really move from one area to another and really see that they're going to have that success like you shared in your story there.
Yeah, so I'm a big believer in post-traumatic growth. I don't ever like to look at these whether it's young people or adults, their trauma survivals is less than. Really, if we can help them get on the other end of that post-traumatic growth loop, they end up being stronger, more resilient, more amazing than if they didn't experience that trauma. And so I always talk to my students about finding those hidden superpowers. So many of our kids are so much more resilient, so much more empathetic. So they have all these hidden gifts because of the tough things they went through, right? But we gotta help them get through that process. And so the thing that makes us so resilient as human beings is connections. We talked in that ACE study that traumatic events are a pretty good predictor of negative outcomes, but a stronger predictor is how well connected we are. Our connection as human beings is our hidden superpower, and so what we really try to do is work on building those connections with as many people as possible. And if I've had the privilege of talking to trauma survivors all over the country, and they always point to one person. I had this coach, I had this uncle, I had this grandparent. They're the reason why I'm here today. They're the reason why I'm successful. And so really trying to train people to be that person, to be that hero in somebody else's life.
Well, I know my audience has heard before, and I get fortunate occasionally to talk to educators too, and I talk about that connections they make with their students. And really, even without trauma, is the best educators are one that connect with their students and where they are, not where the educator is. And one of my lines I always use, I ask them if they've been in education for 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. And I said, the only thing is those students, it's their first year of ever having you, most likely. There's occasionally you may get a repeat. Someone moves up a grade level and then has some of them students again. But the majority of educators experience 1 year with those students, and that connection becomes the difference. And in studies, it shows that our connections of our top connections that we have in business and in life, really, that's who we become and who we're more like all the time. So it's kind of interesting, even in trauma, connections is the number one kind of really key points to it.
Yeah, the research backs that up over and over and over again, dozens, hundreds of studies on this stuff, that connections is that thing that helps us heal and grow. And so I agree with you 100%. And that's why I tell people the vast majority of the time, we don't know if these students have been traumatized. I don't know the trauma history of the vast majority of students I worked with. But guess what? These tools, these interventions work for everybody. And then the other thing is the majority of people have at least one traumatic event in their life. So this is something that's pretty universal. Obviously, some people go through a lot more than other folks, but this is stuff that can benefit anybody in any environment to help them to be more successful.
Super. Tell me a little bit more about your work in schools. You shared the story and things of that nature, but kind of what you're out there doing each day. And, we kind of got a good informed there, but when you're working with schools, with your speaking to try to get them educators to understand that. Share that a little bit more with us.
Yeah, so I get to work at Fulton Public Schools. I'm predominantly in the middle school. My principal's Beth Huff. We've known each other for a long time. I think she's as good a school leader as there is in the world. I mean, she's exceptional. It's the reason why I decided to come to that school. So a big part of what I do every day is I work with dysregulated kids. So kids they might be angry, they might be shut down, they might be anxious. And I really follow, there's a guy named B.D. Perry, phenomenal author, trauma expert, but we talk a lot. He talks a lot about regulate, relate, reason. So regulate is the first thing I want to do is help that student calm down. So that regulate stage. Way too often what we do is we take a dysregulated person and we jump right to the last step, which is reason. We want to have that conversation with them. We want to talk about consequences. They're in the back of their brain. They really can't do any of those things yet. So we really want to calm them down. For some folks, that's giving them an opportunity to vent. For some, it's doing something simple as using a coloring book, listening to music, whatever coping skill, breathing might work for them. Once I have them in a good, calm state, then I want to move on to the relate stage. This is where I just listen to them vent. I don't shut them off. I don't say, well, that's not actually what happened, or no, that teacher would never do that, or hey, what was your part to play in all this? No, I just listen, and I'm an empathetic listener, and that really helps build that attuned relationship. And then once we have that regulate step done, that relate step, then now they're in the front of their brain. Now they have that access to their prefrontal cortex, and then we talk reason, and we break it all the way down. Like, was there anything that triggered you before the event, and try to figure out what that initial trigger was, and then we talk about who they harmed, and then how are they going to repair that harm. So does that look like, for an elementary kid, it might be you tore the stuff off the wall, we got to put back up. For a high school kid, it might be, hey, how are you going to fix that relationship with another student or with another teacher? Because really we learn by repairing the harm. We actually don't learn We don't learn by being removed, by being kicked out, by being suspended, expelled, all those things. And so, I go through that process every day, and that's a big thing that when I go on these trainings, I try to teach people the science behind the trauma-informed stuff. So we talk about the ACE study. We talk about how their students respond to that trauma, what those fight, flight, freeze behaviors look like in a school setting. And then ultimately, I give them those tools to help they regulate, relate, and reason with those students so they can be successful. And so it's, for some schools it's 2 hours, for some it's 2 days. Some schools I've been lucky enough to work with multiple years now and going through that process. To me, it's a never-ending journey. You want to continue to grow, continue to get better. It's exciting to know that, there's kids I'll never get to meet that are being impacted by some of these trainings.
Yeah.
So,
well, it's great work that you're doing, and I love that you're sharing it and really letting the educators know. And if we had an educator here today and you was in front of that audience, and I know you would tell them how, but what's one of the messages that you would really tell them that makes the greatest difference for them to see that change that they need to make? Because part of it is educators, they have to realize everyone in that classroom is not the same. And if we've ever seen that at a time, my podcast goes to 73 different countries and all 50 states. In the world, it's a totally different with this pandemic, because some students are going to be just coming back from almost a year and a half of sitting in a classroom, and I think it's going to create some trauma that's there. So if you were talking to those educators and people that's in that situation, what would you share with them to really make a difference as they go into this new school year, with it already being kind of that time that they're getting in the school year right now?
Yeah, and I really empathize with all the educators out there. I mean, I think this last school year, some of us were in person, some were not in person, mix. It was definitely the most challenging year, I think, to be an educator. So I already think it's really hard on those folks. They need to be able to kind of self-examine what do they need to do to fill up their cup, because it is challenging. But really, the most challenging kids in your school typically have the toughest situations at home.
Yeah.
And so I think it's super easy to get frustrated with those kids, to get angry. They're making your job more difficult. There's no doubt about that. But if we were able to peel back that onion a little bit and see how challenging their life is, most of the time our hearts would break for them. We'd be empathetic for them. And we learn to understand and see them that way. We really want to be that person that can make that impact in their life. And so I think sometimes you got to be able to, take that step back away from that behavior. One thing I like to tell them is when you can look past the behavior and see that unmet need that kid has, you finally see their truth, right? Because most of the time there's an unmet need. And so, do they have that need of connection, that need of being loved, that need, maybe they're just hungry or tired, But when we can look past that behavior to that unmet need, that's, I think, when the great stuff starts happening. So like I said, I empathize. I love all you educators out there. It's super duper important job. I think it's the most important job in our communities right now. But when we can see those kids the proper way, I think we can really start making that impact we want to make, because that's why we're all in it. We're in it for the impact. I've never met an educator that's doing it for a different reason.
Right.
So.
Well, I think that really impacts the educators. Kind of my other question I was going to ask you is, for a lot of us, we've got parents that's in the audience. And of course, the challenge is sometimes with the parents that are listening to self-development and listening to podcasts are not always the ones that have some of the challenges that's there. I'm not saying that some of them don't,
right.
But the problem is, how can parents, where they see that and they know some of their child's friends, they're having some of those challenges, or just know that it's a challenge, and maybe their own son or daughter had some trauma, because again, we're not always talking about it has to be real young. They could have been in a bad accident or seen something that was terrible. How can they help really kind of in that childhood trauma area?
Yeah, and I think don't be afraid to go out and get professional help. We talked about before, over 50% of Americans will experience trauma during their lifetimes, right? And so, 1 out of 8's highly traumatized. There's a good chance, a significant number of people in this audience have experienced those things. So I always say, talk therapy isn't always super successful with people that experience trauma, because talking about the trauma itself can actually create some of those flashbacks and some of those really, really strong feelings. So I think it's really important that when you find a therapist, you find one that is actually specifically trained in working with PTSD and trauma. And EMDR is actually a really good therapeutic model for those things. It's actually pretty easy to find. And so those would be my recommendations. Don't be afraid to seek out and get professional help. A lot of times these things we're not able to work through these things on our own. And so going out there and getting help can make a world of difference in how we get through those things.
Okay.
So.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that, Josh. I tell you, is there anything that really, we've covered a lot of ground with the trauma, but I think it's good, and you're kind of the expert in that field. Is anything you'd like to share with the audience to be able to kind of let them know, or maybe it's a recap? Maybe you think about if, they're an educator, let's go that route. What's a couple suggestions you would tell them? And I'm sure we've talked about it, but I always like recap because sometimes we forget what we hear.
Yeah.
What are a couple of those things as an educator they should do in the classroom?
Yeah, I would come back to those 3 R's, that regulate, relate, reason. So if you're typically in the front of your brain as an educator, you're calm, you're in control. But if you have students in the back of the brain, you got to meet them in the back of the brain. That's that regulate stage. So how do I create opportunities for my students to get regulated? One of the things I loved to do when I was an at-risk teacher was I would start every class period with a 5-minute YouTube video, and we do mindfulness every day to start. And a lot of those kids thought they were too cool for that right away, but after about 2 weeks, if I was in a big hurry and I was trying to skip it, they'd be like, no, we got to do our mindfulness, because they would help them get calm. For a lot of those kids, that might be the first time they've been calm in God knows how long, right? And I'd help them get regulated so they could be in the front of the brain so they can learn. And then also it's going to help the next teacher because they have a regulated kid. And so how do we create opportunities for regulation in the classroom? That relate period, building that attuned relationship by listening to them, not interjecting, and then regulate, relate, reason. We get to that third step where we're gonna break it down. Hey, what was the thing that set you off? What do we do next time that's going to be better? And then how do we repair the harm? And so going through that process. And I know a lot of people think, well, how the heck do I have time for that? But the cool thing is, if you spend time on that early on, instead of fighting these same problems all year long, it's more investment on the front end, but I'm telling you, it's going to make your job as an educator a heck of a lot easier long term.
Yeah, and that mindfulness, I'm telling you, we're learning so much about that, and there's still some people who think that's hocus pocus and everything else. And I'm telling you, I normally do a 2-minute session before I do a podcast. Josh is in studio here, so we were setting up. I didn't get mine in, but I did before I did the previous podcast because I normally cut several in a row, and it just allows me to calm before I go into my workload, because now I'm in the podcast mode. But before I go in that workload, I'll take some time and I'll take a couple minutes to just get mindful again. So I'm working on that project, because otherwise what happens, even for us, our brains are just scattered, and there's so many different situations that it's coming up with. So appreciate you sharing that.
And I tell you what, when I was a teacher, I would do 5 classes a day doing that mindful. Well, how much do you think that helped me? I love that you brought that up, Gary. But now, I'm dealing with some problematic behaviors. I had a lot of at-risk kiddos I'm working with. And so for me to be able to stay calm throughout the day, because I'm doing the mindfulness right there along with the students.
Yeah, makes a big difference. That's one of those tips. Anything else you'd like to share with our Chargers, Josh, as we get ready to wrap up? And I've got to take you through the recharge round because I get to every guest there. But anything you'd like to share? Yeah,
I just encourage people to learn more about this. It's actually a really, really popular topic right now. And so Bruce Perry is an awesome expert on it. He's written a couple great books, but if you want to learn more about it, pick one of those up. He just wrote one with Oprah Winfrey, actually, called What Happened to You. It's a fantastic book. And so I just encourage people, we only had a handful of time to learn about this today, but if any of this strikes your interest, pick that book up. It's super easy to read, super to understand, and you'll be amazed how transformational it can be.
Super. Share with them how they can reach out to you, Josh, and be able to connect with you if they'd like to.
Yeah, I think the best way is on Twitter. I'm pretty active on Twitter. It'd be at Josh Varner 65. So JOSH. V is in Victor, not Barner. I get a lot of Barner. It's Varner. VARNER 65. That's probably the best way. Josh Varner Consulting at gmail.com is another way. You can email me there. I do have a website, joshvarner.com. So any of those 3 ways, I'd be more than happy to connect with anybody. It could be something as simple as I'm looking for a therapist, help me find one. I get a lot of those. Or if you're interested in some of these speaking topics, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah. Give him a call and be a great conversation and stuff on that side of it. And if your school, maybe you're one of those educators, but you're not the principal or the one who makes the decision, maybe share the information that Josh is available to them, because it could really make an impact for your educators to understand that information that's there. Josh, as we go into the recharge round, I have 3 questions that I ask every guest. And of course, the podcast is named Charge for a reason. That's my mantra. Create habits around real goals every day. What habit do you think's led to success in your life?
I think just having an attitude of gratitude. I just got done some yoga before I came over here, and the instructor had a quote, and it was amazing. She was talking about this is that concept of having an attitude of gratitude. A lot of people are, happier with less than you have. And so I trying to continually reframe that mind over and over again to be happy with what I have, all the amazing blessings that I have. And so I think that's super duper important. It's easy to be chasing something, right, all the time, to be content.
Super. Thanks for sharing it. I have a thing. I don't know if you like to go to spa, but I like going to the spa. But my spa is a little different. It's about simple positive actions. What's a simple positive action you do every day to kind of move forward towards your goals?
Yeah, I got this one from a lady named Kenny Femler. She's my old principal, and she would always talk about assuming positive intent. So anytime you're interacting with somebody, assume that whatever their reasoning is, it's coming from a good place. And so that's something I've tried to really train my mind to think about. And so, and then that kind of builds into that next part that I touched about already, but what's the unmet need, right? And so it can be something as simple as I'm talking to my spouse and she's barking back at me a little bit and I'm getting frustrated. Oh, is she eating? Is she hungry? Is she tired? Is she frustrated because we got 3 kids, And so maybe there's an unmet need there. And so if I'm assuming positive intent, I'm thinking about unmet needs, typically I understand people a heck of a lot better and I have better relationships, better connections.
Yeah. And if we put them positive thoughts in, that does make a huge difference. Speak on positivity a lot, and it shows you have to have a 5-to-1 ratio in most aspects of that positive versus negative. And think about our society. That's not easy to do because our society is negative. So I love that you share that. What's your biggest life lesson and what did you learn from it?
So, my dad used to talk about the measure of man, and he used to always say, the measure of man is what he can accomplish when he doesn't feel like doing it. And so when I was a young man, I used to really think, well, that meant, if I'm dinged up in football, I need to play through it, or if I'm tired. But it's interesting how that lesson has kind of changed throughout life. And now I look at it as a parent. Some days as a dad, you don't want to show up or you're worn out, but, you plug in your kid's t-ball game or whatever it might be that you want to be into. And then I really think that professionally in my career, I have an opportunity to, with that neuroplasticity we talked about earlier, change those kids' brain wiring every single day. And so there's days as educators, I don't feel like it. I'm worn out, I'm worn down, but what's that measure of me and the success I'm going to have is that I'm going to bring it for those people every single day. And so that's kind of a quote that's always kind of stuck with me.
Super. I appreciate you sharing that. Josh Varner, it's been a blast having you on the Charge podcast. Thanks for saying yes to joining us.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, Gary, and all the mentoring and the relationship we've had over the years. It's meant a lot to me.
Well, share with them again how they can reach out to you and connect to your website or Twitter.
Yeah, so at Josh Varner 65 on Twitter, joshvarner.com, or joshvarnerconsulting@gmail.com, and I look forward to hearing from you.
Super. We'll have all that in show notes, of course, so if you're driving or exercising or doing something active now, we'll have it in show notes, so just check chargepodcast.com, and Chris will have all the information there for you. Chargers, I hope you're really able to take the information that we shared with you today, because I know as students are getting back into schools and getting started, it could be a really challenging year. But what can we make a difference? Number one is by being informed. So the thing I would ask you to do is, you probably have some educators that you know. I ask you to take and share this podcast with them. There's 3 little dots on your podcast app, depending on which one you've got, and there's a share button, and you can send it right to them as a text message. So if you've got their email or their text message, their mobile number, you can send it right to them. So I would suggest you do that. And remember, keep listening, and we'll have another great guest for next week for you. But keep charging each and every day, and make it a great day. We'll see you next week.
This podcast is ended, but your life doesn't just stop. To continue your inspiring journey, head over to chargepodcast.com and access all the tools and resources mentioned on today's show. If you enjoyed this episode, consider sharing with somebody who may also benefit from the advice provided. That's chargepodcast.com. Until next time, charge in business and life.